Okay, this is Mr. Baer's lecture on the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age is a time period when the 1800s were coming to a close and the start of the 1900s, where there was a real large growing gap between the wealthy and the poor in America. It has the name the Gilded Age because gilding means to be gold plated or covered in gold. So this is not a golden age, but it is a gilded age, which is interesting. A lot of people do become wealthy. People on the surface are wealthy, but a lot of Americans also weren't getting so wealthy. So let's talk a little bit about that. If I had to compare America to any other point in history, I think that you could make I could make a strong comparison to America today being in a new gilded age. Today we see a growing percentage of the wealth being owned by the wealthiest Americans, and the poorest Americans have less and less of the pie. And the Gilded Age was really a time period that was well known for this, where these wealthy captains of industry were making billions of dollars and the typical American really wasn't. This chart just shows that, today the richest 1% own 37% of the wealth, and the 80% bottom poorest people in this country only have about 12%. So that's really showing that the wealthy control a large piece of the pie and poor people really don't have much money at all. In the Gilded Age, there were basically two different approaches or thoughts about why rich people were rich. One theory was the social Darwinism theory, which is based off of evolution, this idea that the strongest survive. And in that, the social Darwinists thought that wealthy people were wealthy because, frankly, they were better than poor people, that they had more skill or intelligence or worked harder, and that they deserved to be rich, this idea of social Darwinism. Other people thought not so much. They thought that the rich got rich simply because they had manipulated the system, and sometimes they were referred to as robber barons, these wealthy people that just continue to steal money and get wealthier and wealthier. Some examples of robber barons of the Gilded Age would be people like Rockefeller, who established Standard Oil, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Carnegie, who was a mover and shaker in the steel industry, J.P. Morgan, who was involved in several industry. And these people became super, super wealthy during the Gilded Age and really benefited from industrialization and the creation of these corporations and became super wealthy. So to revisit this idea of social Darwinism, the thought is basically that the rich deserve to be rich because, frankly, in this theory, they're more deserving. So much like Darwin's theory of evolution, that the fittest survive, the rich have basically won the game is the theory. To kind of put this in perspective, we could look at Bill Gates. Bill Gates is a very wealthy American. This chart says that he makes, $5 billion a year. If you were to break that down into days, he makes, $13.7 million a day, $570,000 an hour, $9,000 a minute, $158 a second. A social Darwinist would say that Bill Gates is smarter, that he is harder working, that he deserves that wealth. That's kind of an extreme thing to say, though. If you think about it, in the amount of time that this video has been going, which I don't know if it's been 2 minutes or how long, maybe 5 minutes. Let's say that we've been talking so long for 5 minutes. In that time, Bill Gates has made close to $50,000. When this video surpasses 6 minutes, 7 minutes, Bill Gates would have earned more money if you broke his annual earnings than I will have all year. And so this doesn't quite sit well with people, the idea that the rich deserve to earn this money, especially when there's such a wide gap between the wealthy and the poor. And the Gilded Age was especially bad for this as well. One of the industries where people made a lot of money were the railroads. Railroads were a big deal. America laid more railroads than any other country. And in this time period, it was a huge source of growth. It would cause industries to spring up all around the country. You would see a lot of movement west for the first time because the railroads would make it more accessible. And railroads were too big for any one normal company or person to fund. So what you had were a lot of people pooling their wealth into these corporations to create these railroads. And as a result, they started to use that business model of corporations all across America. And railroads, in a second I'm going to talk about how they changed businesses and corporations changed our business models. But it also changed simple things like our perception of time zones. This idea that trains could travel from city to city and required tight schedules would be created as a result of railroads. Before this, you would simply set your time based off of when the sun was at its zenith, at the highest point in the sky. So the railroad wasn't only changing our perspective of time, but it created corporations which would be used in all different forms of business. So a corporation works where it has thousands of owners that invest money into a company. And let's say I put, $10,000 into a company and 10 of you put $1,000 into it. Then I would own 50% of the shares and you would each own like one share. So I'd have like 10 shares and the 10 of you would each have one share. So I'm like half owner and you're all 1/10 owners of the company who invested, and they kind of pool that money together. Something that's very similar is corporations can also borrow money from different people through what is called a bond. So because you have multiple investors and that they have the ability to generate these bonds, it gives a lot of money to corporations to get wealth. And as I said, these started in the railroads, but corporations now are in all forms of industry. It's hard for you to find anything that's not corporate made these days. I think something like 90% of all products sold in America are made by a major corporation. So that is very telling. Some advantages of the corporation is over time, because you are a large business, you have the ability to form these monopolies where you are the only provider of a good or service. Monopolies have historically been seen as very bad. Monopolies, since they don't have competition, they can raise the price on the consumer. They can also give inferior product and nobody cares. If you're to think of companies like, cable service and DirecTV, sometimes people have lots of complaints about them. Well, you don't really have very many alternatives because essentially, if you want cable, it's a Comcast monopoly. So that is kind of a problem. Another thing that happened in the Gilded Age was sometimes you didn't have just a single monopoly, but you could have a couple of companies left over, like 3 or 4, and they would form what are called trusts. So a trust would be like if every gas station in Coal City decided, instead of competing with each other and like lowering their price here and there when their competitor does, instead of doing that, they just get together and they agree that they're both going to elevate their prices so that they can make more money. In a sense, when companies form trusts, they stop competing and they behave much like a monopoly would in a market. Another advantage of corporations is their ability to buy out their competitors. Monopoly making is done through what is called the horizontal merger. So on the chart, my horizontal merger, you have McDonald's in the middle. And if you were to think of McDonald's being a fast food provider, purchase Burger King and Wendy's, right? That would create a problem because McDonald's is always in a price war with its competitors, and this keeps the cost of a double cheeseburger down and French fries down, because if McDonald's were to jack up their prices, we'd start eating Burger King or Wendy's. But if McDonald's were to buy those companies, no longer would that threat exist, And if you wanted fast food, your only fast food option would really be McDonald's. So it would become a monopoly over time. So this growing closer to monopoly is called horizontal merging. That's when a company buys its competitors. And during the Gilded Age, you had a lot of companies that were like joining together, or one company purchases the other, and you were getting less and less competition over time. Something else that is interesting would be the vertical merger. A vertical merger, an example of one would be McDonald's buying a cattle farm. What this does, it allows McDonald's to have an advantage because they would not have to pay an increased price for cattle. So like they could, but they don't have to pay any more than the cattle than it costs to raise it. Where if they bought it from an independent rancher, they'd have to pay for that cow, and the rancher's going to make profit off it too. Then McDonald's would have to add that cost to the sale of their cheeseburger. But now, like, I don't know, let's say if they save $20 a cow, they can then cut the price of their hamburgers down to reflect the fact that they're paying less for cows. And that would give them an advantage over Burger King, for example, if they didn't buy their own cows. So this vertical merging is actually sometimes seen as kind of positive because it can benefit not just the company because they make more profit, but also the consumer because it can keep prices down. One of the problems with vertical mergers is, well, it sucks if you own a cattle farm because now all of a sudden McDonald's buying all your cattle farms and you can't make a living raising cows like you would have before McDonald's bought the cow and you could have charged them more. So horizontal merger, McDonald's buys a competitor. Vertical mergers would be McDonald's buys cattle, for an example. Another thing you see quite frequently in corporations is not just these vertical or horizontal mergers, but also the fact that they buy these gigantic various companies that all sort of merge together. And what I have here is sort of like your grocery store conglomerates. For example, if you look at PepsiCo, like PepsiCo makes way more than Pepsi. Obviously they have soft drinks of Pepsi and Gatorade and Tropicana and Mug Root Beer. And all of that, but we're familiar with that because when you go to Burcott's, Pepsi, if Pepsi products are on sale, you can buy a Pepsi and a Mug Root Beer and a Mountain Dew, and it all counts together. But what you may not realize is not only are those people selling those soft drinks, but also they are selling you your Chewy granola bar and your Quaker Oats and your Sun Chips that you eat at lunch. And when you really look at it, there's at its core only a couple of different food companies really at the grocery store. Same thing with like Pepsi owns Yum, which owns all of these restaurants like Kentucky Fried Chicken, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, which is why sometimes you see like Kentucky Huts, right? Kentucky Fried, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut merged together because one company owns all of those businesses. And that is sometimes an advantage for major corporations as well. And there are a lot of conglomerates made during the Gilded Age as well. So merging allows people to diversify their income. Like if you're PepsiCo and people just stop drinking Pepsi, that's okay because you can still make money off of Taco Bells and Quaker Oats and granola bars and all these different things. So like, yeah, I don't know if like some plant you use to make Pepsi goes extinct, you could still survive as a company. Whereas if you were solely invested in soft drinks, that could, it could be a problem. Major corporations also benefit from the economy of scale because they are buying so many more than small companies. They can get a really cheap price on this. A company well known for this is Walmart. If you think about all the Walmart stores across America, they buy millions and millions of products compared to like a Burcott's. So like if you're Tombstone Pizza and Burcott's wants to buy your pizza, well, you got to make a profit on it, so you're going to up the price. But if Walmart's going to buy your pizza, you got to up the price to make profit too. But Walmart can tell you that they're going to sell millions times more pizzas, and so you should give them a cheaper price. And so that tends to happen. And of course, there's the horizontal merger, the vertical merger that we've talked about. One practice that Walmart has been accused of in the past is something called predatory pricing. And this is where they literally set their prices super low to try to run competitors out of business. So like they might sell frozen pizza at a loss, for example, and then all of a sudden, food stores around the area go out of business because they can't keep up with Walmart, and then Walmart gets all the business there because all the local grocery stores have closed down. So we're going to be looking at some stock today. Some terms about stock you should be familiar with is the idea of a shareholder. That's someone who owns the stock. A dividend is actually if the company ever splits up its profit and shares it with their employees. That's kind of rare. That's not actually what we're going to be looking at in our stock portfolios. What we're going to be looking for is a capital gain. Capital gain is this idea that you buy for one price and you sell for a higher price. And that is the way most people kind of play the stock market. They're looking for companies, and the prices fluctuate in the value of these companies, and they buy them for a low price and they hold on to them for however long and then turn around and try to sell them. Capital gains not only seen in stock, but you can think of things like collectibles, like comic books. If you bought the very first Action comic for 10 cents, today you could probably sell that comic book for, who knows, tens of thousands of dollars probably, and that's a massive capital gain. The places where stocks are bought and sold are called stock markets, where stock is publicly traded, and I'll probably talk more about that at a later date. The New York Stock Exchange is one of the largest in the world. When we do our stock market activity, I'm going to want you to stick to two different markets, the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, but I think you're going to find most corporations you'd search for are going to fit into those two markets. This video, I'll have you watch on your own and answer questions about, so I don't need to narrate over the top of it, but it's to get you to think about the gap between wealthy and poor and kind of how that exists in America today. So, do you believe in social Darwinism? Anybody? If so, why? Probably because you feel that people who work hard get rewarded. If not, you would say, well, not really, because wealthy people aren't always the hardest workers. Sometimes they're just lucky. A trust to a monopoly are pretty much the same thing. But businesses who have a monopoly have an advantage. A trust is when they act like a monopoly. The types of merger, vertical, let's go back to McDonald's. A vertical merger would be McDonald's buying ranches to make their hamburgers or buying trucks to supply their equipment. That would be vertical merging. Horizontal merger would be McDonald's buying out a competitor like Wendy's. And a conglomerate would be like McDonald's buying something weird like a car company, right? So you can buy, you could drive your Mick car, which would just be weird. But there are all sorts of corporate conglomerates around there. So if you could buy any stock 2 years ago, what would you have bought and why? So you got to think about companies that really weren't established 2 years ago that exist today. I might invest in companies like Roku, internet online streaming, because that's a growing trend. Maybe, I don't know, I'd really have to think about it for a little bit to come up with something. But this is the idea of the Gilded Age, where people made a lot of money, corporations made a lot of money. Next class, we're going to talk about people who didn't really make so much money and how that they would want a bigger piece of a pie and push for labor unions and shares like that. So that's the Gilded Age in summary. Hope you're good for the sub and pay attention to Classroom for your other lessons.